Welcome back to the Fulton County Gospel News Podcast. My name is Barry Odell, and I am your host. Fulton County Gospel News is a bi-monthly publication of the Church of Christ in Mammoth Spring, Arkansas. And if you'd like to learn more about our paper, just visit our website, mammothspringchurchofchrist.com, and you can find all the necessary information there. You can receive the paper. It's always free of charge as a PDF in your email. You can receive it as a hard copy through the United States Postal Service, or you can receive a bundle of the papers through the Postal Service, and then you can hand them out to whoever you like. So let us know what we can do for you, and we'll be happy to add you to one of our mailing lists. Also, if you've not yet done so, like and follow our Podbean channel, podbean.com, and look for Fulton County Gospel News, and you will get a notification when each new edition comes out, and you can also interact with each episode on Podbean. And you can also follow us on Facebook, either the Church of Christ at Mammoth Spring Facebook page or Fulton County Gospel News podcast. All right, so we have all that out of the way. Let's talk about our subject for today. So a while back, last year I think it was, 2021, I started a series of articles that's still going on, and of course this is only bi-monthly, so that comes out every other month. But the thought behind this series is, I believe. And so kind of brought about by the idea that people say, well, you're only known for what you're against. Tell me what you believe in. So what we're doing in this series of articles is we're going through the biblical text and picking out certain things that the Bible is very clear on that we can find, I think importantly, both in the Old Testament and the New Testament. Now we understand that we are under the jurisdiction of the New Covenant, the law of Christ, but the Old Testament was written for our learning. And so what I've tried to do in this series of articles when I write or when I have someone write for me is start in the Old Testament and then make a connection to the New and see where it falls in line with the law of Christ today. So for the January-February edition of Fulton County Gospel News, the front page article was written by me, and the title of that article is, I Believe in God's Sexual Ethic. And again, this is a progressive study throughout the text of the Old Testament. And the basis of this particular article is from Leviticus chapter 18, where Israel is in the process of the Exodus on their way to the Promised Land, and God is giving them warnings. I'm turning my Bible over to Leviticus chapter 18. God is giving them warnings about the inhabitants of the land, about the practices of the inhabitants of that land, and what Israel is and is not to do in view of all that. So we're not going to read all of Leviticus chapter 18, but as I do in the article, I'm going to read a couple verses to you. For instance, Leviticus chapter 18, and I'll just start in verse 1. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, and say to them, I am the Lord your God. According to the doings of the land of Egypt, where you dwelt, you shall not do. And according to the doings of the land of Canaan, where I am bringing you, you shall not do, nor shall you walk in their ordinances. You shall observe my judgments, and keep my ordinances, to walk in them. I am the Lord your God. You shall therefore keep my statutes and my judgments, which if a man does them, he shall live by them. I am the Lord. So God sets himself and his law out as the standard, and then beginning in Leviticus 18 and verse 6, God gets very specific with the ordinances and practices of the land and what Israel was not to do. Beginning in verse 6 then of chapter 18, God gets very specific with the practices of the people of the land, the promised land, Canaan, and what Israel was not to do. And that goes down through verse 23. And then beginning in verse 24, we read this, Do not defile yourselves with any of these things, for by all these things the nations are defiled, which I am casting out before you, for the land is defiled. Therefore I visit the punishment of its iniquity upon it, and the land vomits out its inhabitants. And then again, God gives Israel a warning about what they are not to do. And then he says in Leviticus 18, beginning in verse 28, that if you do these things, the land will vomit you out also when you defile it, as it vomited out the nations that were before you. Now that's a pretty rough word picture. I don't know of many people who enjoy vomiting. Okay, I'm a parent. I've got 2 kids. They're teenagers now. When they were young, it seemed to be more of an issue. But kids get sick, they throw up. Adults get sick, they throw up. Nobody enjoys doing that, and nobody enjoys cleaning that up. All right, it stinks, it's nasty, We just don't want any involvement with that. Well, that's the language that God uses in regard to what he addresses here in Leviticus chapter 18 for Israel that we can take lessons from today, and that is a sexual ethic. So let's define the word ethic real quick. You look that up in a dictionary, and the word ethic means this: a set of moral principles, especially ones relating to or affirming a specified group, field, or form of conduct. And so then what I do in that article is I lay out the case that Jesus is our authority for today based on John 12, verses 48 and 49, and that we need to listen to the words of Jesus, Hebrews chapter 1 and verse 2. God has in these last days spoken unto us by his Son. But again, this is all framed from the Old Testament, and then we move into the New Testament. And I thought a good way to summarize this concept of God's sexual ethic is found in Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 4. The Bible there says, "Marriage is honorable in all, and the bed undefiled, but fornicators and adulterers God will judge." And I know the King James uses the word whoremongers, but I don't know why it uses that term, but the Greek word is porneia, fornicators, okay? God will judge fornicators and those who commit adultery. And when you look at God's law on the sexual relationship between a man and a woman, and that's what it is, it's between a man and a woman, or that's God's design, God's intent. We know that man has long corrupted that design, that ideal, let's say. But here's what I write in part of this article. God deemed from the beginning of creation male and female. For this cause shall a man leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and they shall be one flesh. So then they are no longer two, but one flesh. And that comes from Mark chapter 10 and verses 6 through 9. And so God's ethic then, that is God's set of moral principles in regard to a sexual relationship, is that it be between a man and a woman only within the bonds of marriage. And any other sexual relationship is fornication, period. And there are multiple places where the Bible addresses this, both in the Old and the New Testament. One of the passages that I reference here is 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 2, where Paul's answering some questions that the Corinthians had, and he does that particularly in 1 Corinthians, but they had written him some very specific questions, and one of those was about fornication. And so in 1 Corinthians 7 and verse 2, he says, "Nevertheless, to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife, and let every woman have her own husband." And he goes on then to instruct them in 1 Corinthians 7, verses 3 through 5, that the husband and wife belong to one another, and that they are to render the due affection to each other. The sexual relationship between a man and a woman is a privilege that is only to be realized within the bonds of marriage. And that relationship is not to be used as a tool. It's not to be used as a weapon against a spouse if you're angry at them or something's not right between the two of you. And I've seen that over the years as a preacher talking to couples, that relationship has been abused in that way. Paul says, no, you don't do that. In fact, one of the things that he says there early on in 1 Corinthians 7 is that if you do hold back from one another physically, you need to consent. Okay, you need to come to an agreement, but then you need to come back together in order to avoid fornication. So there are a lot of passages that address this subject, specifically of fornication, adultery, the sexual relationship. So I mentioned in the text of this article, 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 9 and 10, that there are some people who will not inherit the kingdom of God, and here are some specifics mentioned: fornicators, adulterers, effeminate, and abusers of themselves with mankind. Now that's King James language. The New King James and some of your modern versions word it a bit differently, but it's saying the same thing. And then also from Romans chapter 1 and verses 26 through 28. And I tell you, in my opinion, if you want to use a passage to discuss homosexuality and God's view of it, it needs to be Romans chapter 1. In that text, Paul talks about vile affections. He talks about things that are against nature, women being with women, men being with men, and leaving the natural use of the woman. It's the practices that are so prevalent, and this is the thing in our society. It's not just that it's prevalent, okay? I know a lot of people personally who are of this persuasion, okay, who are homosexuals. It's not just that it's prevalent. It's that it is constantly pushed upon us by our media, by social media, by political leaders. It's in our face all the time. And a Christian needs to be grounded in God's sexual ethic. So here's another passage. Colossians chapter 3 and verse 5 talks about those who will receive the wrath of God. Well, one of those is fornicators. Okay, again, fornication is any illicit sexual relationship outside of marriage. Okay? Again, that physical relationship is only to be enjoyed between a husband and wife. So here's the main point of this article. God has revealed a sexual ethic to humanity. It goes all the way back to the creation itself, and it applies to all, believer and non-believer alike. And I think that's a hang-up sometimes with people. God's marriage law, and typically we go to Matthew 19, and I think rightly so, to address that subject, but a lot of people think and actually teach that law only applies to Christians. Listen, when Jesus is answering the questions of the Pharisees there in Matthew chapter 19, okay, number one, Christianity is not in existence in the first place, but Jesus' own language there tells me that it's universal in nature. This marriage law, if you want to phrase it that way, applies to everybody. That's why Jesus uses the terminology, whosoever. Now again, we know society is very tolerant. Society is very accepting of all manners of behavior, particularly in this realm. But listen, we as Christians need to know what God's Word says. We can't fool ourselves. We can't be naive and think, well, this stuff, homosexuality, fornication, adultery, this stuff doesn't affect the church. If we take that position, if we actually believe that, I would say naive is a very weak word to describe us. I myself, as a preacher over the years, have had to address this in every congregation that I have worked with, sadly. I've even seen statistics. A few years ago, I saw a statistic that said that the divorce rate among Christians is just as high as the divorce rate among non-believers. That's hard to believe, and that's unacceptable. Remember, fornicators and adulterers God will judge, going back to Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 4. And I don't know if maybe it's the case that some preachers think, well, I don't need to address this stuff in a mixed audience, or what. I don't know why this subject isn't addressed more. It needs to be. The thing is, it's not a complicated issue. I mean, the Bible, and that's the thing. When you go to, again, Matthew 19, a very familiar passage, when the disciples, or rather when the Pharisees come with a very specific question to Jesus, can we put away our wives for just any cause? What does Jesus do? He goes all the way back to creation. That's God's intent. That's God's ideal for marriage. A man leaves his father and mother, leaves a home that's already in existence. He joins himself to his wife, and they create their own home. They become one. Now, obviously, there's a lot more to that than just the sexual relationship, but that relationship is involved in the husband and wife becoming one. Another strange idea that I've heard that frankly is unbiblical is that the relationship between a man and a woman in marriage, the only reason that they should come together physically like that is to produce children. Listen, the Bible doesn't teach that anywhere. In fact, when you read the early verses of 1 Corinthians chapter 7, quite the opposite is taught. Remember what it says in verse 2. To avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife, and let every woman have her own husband. That's speaking directly to the sexual relationship between a man and a woman. And God created that relationship. God created a man and a woman in a very specific way. But He also created marriage and that relationship in a very specific way. And that's where that relationship is to be kept pure. Again, as Hebrews 13:4 says, undefiled. The bed is to be undefiled. And if we do anything else, we're fornicators or adulterers. So this is a subject that we need to be well educated on, spiritually speaking. We need to know what God expects of husbands and wives and the relationship that exists between them. Because it's been that way, again, from the beginning of creation. That's the way Mark records it in Mark chapter 10 and verses 6 through 9. So I believe in God's sexual ethic. And you think about it, okay? Think about the consequences of not following God's sexual ethic. Again, a set of moral principles or dealing with a form of conduct. Think about the divorce rate. And not just the divorce rate. Think about the far-reaching and perhaps unintended consequences of divorce. The difficulties that a husband and wife who are now divorced are going to have to deal with for the rest of their lives. Raising their children, sharing money, supporting each other throughout the years, being a parent to that child. What about college decisions? I mean, there are so many far-reaching negative consequences that people don't think about in the moment. Maybe a man or a woman has been unfaithful to his or her husband. They've committed adultery, okay? They've committed fornication, all right? And as such, they are now adulterers. They got caught up in the moment, perhaps, and they repent of that sin. Well, ultimately, that's what we hope happens, and that's, in fact, what needs to happen. But that original marriage is changed forever, sadly. Sometimes it ends in divorce. It doesn't have to end in divorce. We know that. But most of the time it does. And there are so many consequences that follow those people and their children and their extended families and the community in which they live and the church that they attend. I mean, it just goes on and on. The consequences that people don't think about in, as we say, in the heat of the moment. I love Joseph's example from Genesis chapter 39. A young man tempted every day by a woman to, as she said, "Come lie with me." And his response was, "I cannot do this thing and sin against God." See, it would have been a sin against her husband, obviously, and a sin against himself, and a sin against that woman. But ultimately, when it comes down to sin, ultimately it's against God. And that's where we need to keep our mind. I need to know what God's sexual ethic is. And again, I can draw from the Old Testament, and I can learn from that and apply it and be governed by the New Testament at the same time. But I need to know what He has spoken, and I need to live accordingly. There are so many consequences if we break God's sexual ethic. Well, listen, I appreciate you tuning into this edition of the Fulton County Gospel News podcast. And again, this comes from the February 2022 edition. This is the newest one, hot off the presses, as we say. It'll be ready for mailing at the end of this month, at the end of January 2022. So you can be looking forward to that. But thanks for listening to this episode. Again, if you're interested in the paper, just visit our website, mammothspringchurchofchrist.com. If you've not done so, subscribe to our Podbean channel, get notifications, and interact with each individual episode. But thanks again for listening today, and I will catch you on the next episode of the Fulton County Gospel News podcast.